Question 1. The efficiency study reveals that current candidate screening processes are time-consuming, potentially delaying the onboarding of qualified individuals. To expedite this, a proposal suggests leveraging an AI-powered tool that analyzes candidate resumes for keywords and experience, aiming to significantly reduce manual review time. However, concerns have been raised about the potential for algorithmic bias within such tools. Option A. Immediately implement the AI-powered tool as recommended by the efficiency study, assuming that the time savings will outweigh any potential, unproven risks of bias. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive audit of the AI tool's algorithms and historical performance data to identify and mitigate any potential biases before implementation, while simultaneously reviewing and updating existing hiring policies to ensure alignment with fair hiring practices and regulatory requirements. Option C. Rely on the vendor's assurance that the AI tool is unbiased and proceed with its implementation, focusing solely on the efficiency gains reported in the study. Option D. Reject the AI-powered tool outright, citing the potential for bias, and continue with the existing, albeit slower, manual screening process without further investigation into alternative solutions. Correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive audit of the AI tool's algorithms and historical performance data to identify and mitigate any potential biases before implementation, while simultaneously reviewing and updating existing hiring policies to ensure alignment with fair hiring practices and regulatory requirements. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the pursuit of operational efficiency, as highlighted by the study, with the paramount duty to uphold regulatory compliance and ethical standards. The RTX hiring assessment test, by its nature, assesses an individual's ability to navigate such complex situations where business objectives might seemingly conflict with legal and ethical obligations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any proposed efficiency measures do not inadvertently lead to discriminatory practices or violate established hiring regulations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough review of existing hiring policies and procedures against the backdrop of relevant RTX-mandated guidelines and any applicable external regulatory frameworks. This ensures that any proposed changes are not only efficient, but also legally sound and ethically defensible. It demonstrates a commitment to fair and equitable hiring, which is a cornerstone of responsible corporate conduct and a key expectation in professional assessments. This approach proactively identifies potential risks and ensures that efficiency gains are achieved without compromising integrity or compliance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on implementing the efficiency study's recommendations without due diligence fails to acknowledge the potential for unintended consequences. This could lead to regulatory breaches if the recommended changes, for instance, inadvertently disadvantage protected groups, thereby violating anti-discrimination laws. Another incorrect approach, which dismisses the efficiency study entirely without proper evaluation, represents a failure to embrace opportunities for improvement and could be seen as a lack of strategic thinking and a missed chance to optimize processes within legal and ethical boundaries. A third incorrect approach, which attempts to implement changes based on anecdotal evidence or personal bias rather than a systematic review, is fundamentally flawed as it lacks the rigor required for sound decision-making and opens the door to subjective and potentially discriminatory practices, directly contravening professional standards and regulatory expectations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the objective efficiency study findings, then systematically evaluates proposed solutions against established criteria, regulatory compliance, ethical guidelines, company policy. This involves risk assessment, seeking expert advice if necessary, and ensuring transparency in the decision-making process. The goal is to achieve the desired outcome efficiency in a manner that is sustainable, compliant, and ethically sound. Question 2. The efficiency study reveals that significant cost savings can be achieved by automating client onboarding and portfolio review processes. However, the proposed automation solution has not undergone independent validation for its adherence to all current regulatory disclosure requirements and suitability assessment protocols. Which of the following represents the most prudent and professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Delay the implementation of the automation solution until a comprehensive, independent audit confirms its full compliance with all relevant regulatory disclosure requirements and suitability assessment protocols. Option B. Implement the automation solution with a plan to conduct a post-implementation review of its regulatory compliance and suitability assessment capabilities. Option C. Implement the automation solution for non-critical client interactions only, while maintaining manual processes for high-risk client onboarding and portfolio reviews. Option D. Proceed with the full automation of client onboarding and portfolio reviews immediately to realize cost savings, assuming the underlying logic is generally sound. The correct answer is B. Implement the automation solution with a plan to conduct a post-implementation review of its regulatory compliance and suitability assessment capabilities. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the pursuit of operational efficiency with the fundamental duty to act in the best interests of clients and to maintain market integrity. The pressure to reduce costs through automation, while potentially beneficial for the firm, must not compromise the quality of advice, the accuracy of information provided, or the adherence to regulatory standards designed to protect investors. Careful judgment is required to ensure that technological advancements enhance, rather than detract from, client outcomes and regulatory compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, phased implementation of automation, coupled with robust human oversight and continuous validation against regulatory requirements. This aligns with the principles of responsible innovation, ensuring that new technologies are integrated in a way that upholds fiduciary duties, maintains data integrity, and prevents potential breaches of regulations such as those concerning suitability, disclosure, and record-keeping. It demonstrates a commitment to client protection and regulatory adherence as paramount, even when faced with efficiency targets. An incorrect approach that solely focuses on rapid, unvalidated automation without adequate human review risks significant regulatory and ethical failures. This could lead to the dissemination of inaccurate or misleading information to clients, violating rules against misrepresentation, and potentially causing financial harm. Furthermore, a lack of oversight could result in automated systems failing to identify or flag transactions that are unsuitable for clients, breaching suitability obligations. The failure to maintain proper audit trails and records of automated decision-making processes would also contravene record-keeping requirements. Another incorrect approach that relies on outdated or poorly integrated automation systems, without regular updates or checks for compatibility with evolving regulatory landscapes, would similarly fall short. This could lead to non-compliance with current regulations, even if the systems were compliant at the time of implementation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the regulatory obligations and ethical duties relevant to the proposed efficiency measure. This involves assessing the potential impact on clients, the integrity of the market, and the firm's compliance posture. A risk-based approach should then be adopted, identifying potential pitfalls and developing mitigation strategies. Pilot testing, phased rollouts, and ongoing monitoring with clear escalation procedures for identified issues are crucial. Finally, continuous training for staff on the capabilities and limitations of automated systems and the importance of human judgment is essential to foster a culture of compliance and client centricity. Question 3. The performance metrics show that a client who has consistently expressed a low tolerance for risk and a desire for capital preservation has recently made several speculative investments that have resulted in significant losses. Despite these losses, the client continues to state that they are risk-averse. How should a financial professional best address this situation to ensure the client's portfolio remains suitable and aligned with their overall financial objectives? Option A. Immediately liquidate all speculative positions and reallocate the portfolio to ultra-conservative investments, overriding the client's stated preferences due to their inconsistent behavior. Option B. Focus solely on the client's recent investment behavior and make adjustments to the portfolio to reflect this more aggressive stance, without further discussion about their stated risk tolerance or long-term goals. Option C. Initiate a detailed discussion with the client to understand the motivations behind their recent investment choices, reevaluate their financial goals and overall risk capacity in light of their behavior, and propose portfolio adjustments that genuinely reflect their best interests and regulatory requirements for suitability. Option D. Continue to manage the portfolio based on the client's stated low-risk tolerance, assuming their recent actions were an anomaly and not indicative of a deeper change or misunderstanding. The correct answer is C. Initiate a detailed discussion with the client to understand the motivations behind their recent investment choices, reevaluate their financial goals and overall risk capacity in light of their behavior, and propose portfolio adjustments that genuinely reflect their best interests and regulatory requirements for suitability. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in financial advisory, where a client's stated risk tolerance appears to contradict their investment behavior and stated financial goals. The professional must navigate this discrepancy to ensure the client's portfolio aligns with their true needs and capacity for risk, while adhering to regulatory obligations regarding suitability and client best interests. The challenge lies in balancing the client's expressed preferences with objective assessment and regulatory mandates. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a multifaceted strategy that prioritizes understanding the client's complete financial picture and reconciling the conflicting information. This includes a thorough review of their financial situation, a deeper discussion to uncover the reasons behind the stated risk tolerance versus actual behavior, and proposing adjustments that genuinely serve the client's best interests. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate suitability assessments and the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, ensuring that investment recommendations are appropriate for their circumstances, objectives, and risk tolerance. It emphasizes a proactive and client-centric approach. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves solely relying on the client's stated risk tolerance, even when it conflicts with their actions and goals. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for a comprehensive suitability assessment, as it ignores crucial behavioral and objective financial data. It risks recommending investments that are either too risky or too conservative, potentially leading to client dissatisfaction, financial harm, and regulatory breaches related to suitability. Another incorrect approach is to immediately override the client's stated preferences without further investigation or discussion. While the client's behavior may indicate a mismatch, a professional must engage in dialogue to understand the underlying reasons. Dismissing their stated preferences outright can damage the client relationship and may not lead to the most appropriate solution if the client's underlying concerns are not addressed. This approach can be seen as paternalistic and may not fully comply with the spirit of client-centric advice. A third incorrect approach is to make significant portfolio changes based solely on the observed behavior without reevaluating the client's stated goals and risk tolerance in a structured manner. While behavior is a strong indicator, it needs to be contextualized within a renewed understanding of the client's overall financial plan and objectives. This can lead to reactive rather than strategic adjustments, potentially missing opportunities or creating new misalignments. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making process. First, acknowledge and document all available information, including stated preferences, observed behavior, and financial goals. Second, identify discrepancies and formulate hypotheses about their causes. Third, engage in open and probing dialogue with the client to explore these discrepancies. Fourth, conduct a thorough reassessment of suitability based on all gathered information. Fifth, propose a revised investment strategy that demonstrably aligns with the client's best interests, supported by clear explanations. This process ensures compliance, builds trust, and leads to more effective client outcomes. Question 4. Operational review demonstrates that the firm's current client onboarding process is time-consuming and inefficient, leading to delays in account opening. A new, integrated digital platform promises to significantly streamline this process, including automated data capture and digital signature capabilities. However, the implementation plan proposes a rapid, company-wide rollout with minimal user training, focusing primarily on the IT department's ability to deploy the software. The plan also suggests that data migration from the old system to the new platform will be largely automated, with limited manual verification of transferred client information. Which of the following approaches best balances the need for operational efficiency with the absolute priority of regulatory compliance and client data protection? Option A. Prioritize the rapid deployment of the new platform across the entire firm to achieve immediate efficiency gains. Rely on the platform's built-in automated controls for data security and assume that automated data migration will be sufficiently accurate. Option B. Expedite the rollout by focusing solely on the technical aspects of the platform's implementation, deferring extensive user training until after the system is fully operational. Delegate the responsibility for ensuring data integrity and compliance to the IT department. Option C. Proceed with a full-scale rollout of the new platform, emphasizing speed over data migration accuracy. Assume that any minor data discrepancies can be rectified post-launch through ad hoc corrections by individual users. Option D. Implement the new digital platform in phases, starting with a pilot group, and provide comprehensive, role-specific training to all staff who will interact with the system. Conduct thorough data validation and reconciliation before and after migration, involving both IT and compliance teams in the oversight. The correct answer is D. Implement the new digital platform in phases, starting with a pilot group, and provide comprehensive, role-specific training to all staff who will interact with the system. Conduct thorough data validation and reconciliation before and after migration, involving both IT and compliance teams in the oversight. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between achieving operational efficiency and adhering to stringent regulatory requirements for data handling and client confidentiality. The need to streamline processes must be balanced against the absolute priority of protecting sensitive client information, a core tenet of financial services regulation. Missteps in this area can lead to significant reputational damage, regulatory sanctions, and loss of client trust. The correct approach, which involves implementing a phased rollout of the new system with mandatory, role-specific training and robust data validation checks, represents best professional practice because it proactively addresses potential compliance gaps. This method prioritizes client data security by ensuring that personnel are adequately trained on new procedures and that the system itself is designed to prevent unauthorized access or data breaches. It aligns with regulatory expectations that firms must have appropriate systems and controls in place to safeguard client assets and information. The phased approach allows for controlled testing and refinement, minimizing the risk of widespread noncompliance. An incorrect approach that bypasses comprehensive training and relies solely on automated controls fails to acknowledge the human element in compliance. While automation is valuable, it cannot fully substitute for informed decision-making by staff. This approach risks regulatory failure because it may not adequately cover edge cases or scenarios not anticipated by the automation, potentially leading to breaches of data privacy regulations. Another incorrect approach, which prioritizes speed of implementation over thorough testing of data migration integrity, is also professionally unacceptable. This could result in corrupted or lost client data, a direct violation of fiduciary duties and regulatory mandates concerning record-keeping and client asset protection. A third incorrect approach, that delegates the responsibility for compliance oversight solely to the IT department without involving compliance and legal teams, is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. Compliance is a firm-wide responsibility, and excluding key stakeholders from the oversight process creates blind spots and increases the likelihood of overlooking critical regulatory obligations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of all applicable regulations and internal policies. This should be followed by a risk assessment of the proposed operational change, identifying potential compliance vulnerabilities. Solutions should then be developed that mitigate these risks, prioritizing client protection and regulatory adherence. Continuous monitoring and review are essential to ensure ongoing compliance and adapt to evolving regulatory landscapes. Question 5. The assessment process reveals that a client, Ms. Anya Sharma, has expressed a strong desire to invest a significant portion of her retirement savings into a highly speculative, unproven technology startup. Ms. Sharma states she has heard positive buzz about the company and believes it will yield substantial returns, despite having a moderate risk tolerance and limited experience with such volatile investments. As her financial advisor, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Inform Ms. Sharma that her request is entirely unsuitable and refuse to discuss it further, as her stated risk tolerance clearly contradicts the nature of the investment. Option B. Immediately execute the investment as requested by Ms. Sharma, as her instructions are paramount and she is the ultimate decision-maker for her funds. Option C. Conduct a detailed assessment of Ms. Sharma's overall financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, and then explain to her the potential risks and suitability concerns associated with the proposed investment, offering alternative strategies that align with her profile. Option D. Proceed with the investment but assure Ms. Sharma that the risks are minimal and that she should expect significant gains, focusing on the potential upside. Correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed assessment of Ms. Sharma's overall financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, and then explain to her the potential risks and suitability concerns associated with the proposed investment, offering alternative strategies that align with her profile. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in financial advisory, where a client's stated investment objectives may not align with their risk tolerance or financial capacity. The professional must navigate the client's expressed desires against the backdrop of regulatory obligations to ensure suitability and prevent potential harm. The challenge lies in balancing client autonomy with the fiduciary duty to act in their best interest, particularly when the client's request could lead to undue risk. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, followed by an explanation of why the requested investment may not be suitable. This aligns with the core principles of Know Your Client KIC and suitability requirements mandated by financial regulatory bodies. Specifically, it upholds the duty to provide advice that is appropriate for the client's circumstances, ensuring that any recommendation is in their best interest. This process involves gathering comprehensive information, analyzing it, and then communicating the findings and recommendations clearly and transparently, allowing the client to make an informed decision. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately proceed with the client's request without further investigation. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for suitability. It prioritizes client instruction over the professional's duty to assess and advise on appropriate investments, potentially exposing the client to unacceptable risks and violating ethical standards of care. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without understanding the underlying reasons or exploring alternatives. This demonstrates a lack of client centricity and a failure to engage in a consultative process. While the request may be unsuitable, a professional should explore the client's motivations and attempt to find a suitable alternative that meets their underlying needs, rather than simply refusing. This can lead to client dissatisfaction and a breakdown in trust, and may also miss opportunities to educate the client about appropriate investment strategies. A third incorrect approach would be to proceed with the investment while downplaying the associated risks. This is a direct violation of the duty to provide accurate and complete information. Misrepresenting or minimizing risks is deceptive and unethical, and can lead to significant client losses and regulatory sanctions. Transparency about all potential downsides is a fundamental aspect of professional conduct. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the client's profile. This involves active listening, thorough data gathering, and critical analysis. When a client's request appears misaligned with their profile, the professional's duty is to investigate, educate, and propose suitable alternatives. This process should be documented, and all communications with the client should be clear, transparent, and focused on their best interests, adhering strictly to all applicable regulatory guidelines and ethical codes. Question 6. System analysis indicates that a financial advisor has received a specific instruction from a long-standing client to invest a significant portion of their portfolio into a highly speculative, illiquid asset class that the client has recently become interested in. Despite the client's previously stated conservative risk tolerance and stated long-term financial goals, the advisor has conducted preliminary research and believes this investment is not suitable for the client's profile and may carry undisclosed risks. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Advise the client that the investment is too risky and refuse to proceed, without offering any further explanation or alternative solutions. Option B. Proceed with the investment as instructed, but highlight the speculative nature of the asset class in a brief disclaimer, while reassuring the client that their instructions are being followed. Option C. Execute the client's instruction immediately to maintain client satisfaction and avoid potential conflict, assuming the client understands the risks involved. Option D. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment of the proposed investment against the client's stated objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation, and if deemed unsuitable, clearly explain the concerns and recommend alternative, more appropriate investment strategies that align with the client's profile. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment of the proposed investment against the client's stated objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation, and if deemed unsuitable, clearly explain the concerns and recommend alternative, more appropriate investment strategies that align with the client's profile. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's explicit instructions and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when those instructions might lead to suboptimal outcomes or regulatory breaches. The advisor must navigate the delicate balance of respecting client autonomy while upholding professional integrity and regulatory compliance. The pressure to retain a client can also create an incentive to overlook potential issues, making objective judgment crucial. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing the client's long-term financial well-being and regulatory adherence over immediate client satisfaction or convenience. This involves a thorough, objective assessment of the proposed investment, considering its suitability based on the client's stated objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation. It also necessitates clear, transparent communication with the client, explaining the rationale behind any reservations or recommendations for alternative solutions. This aligns with the core principles of fiduciary duty, which mandate acting with loyalty, care, and good faith, and adhering to regulatory requirements that protect investors from unsuitable or harmful products. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves blindly executing the client's instructions without independent verification or suitability assessment. This fails to uphold the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest and could lead to significant financial harm if the investment is inappropriate. It also risks violating regulatory obligations that require advisors to ensure investments are suitable for their clients. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright without providing a reasoned explanation or exploring alternatives. While the client's request might be ill-advised, a complete dismissal can damage the client relationship and fail to educate the client on sound investment principles. This approach lacks the professional courtesy and client-centric focus expected of an advisor. A third incorrect approach is to proceed with the investment while downplaying potential risks or misrepresenting the product's characteristics to appease the client. This constitutes a serious ethical and regulatory breach, involving dishonesty and a failure to provide accurate information, which can lead to severe penalties and reputational damage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the client's needs and objectives. This is followed by an objective assessment of any proposed course of action against established professional standards, regulatory requirements, and ethical principles. When a conflict arises, the professional must prioritize their fiduciary and regulatory obligations. Transparent and honest communication is paramount, involving explaining concerns, providing evidence-based reasoning, and offering suitable alternatives. Documenting all advice and client interactions is also a critical step in demonstrating due diligence and protecting both the client and the professional. Question 7. Quality control measures reveal a pattern of minor deviations in transaction processing times that, individually, fall within acceptable operational tolerances, but collectively suggest a potential systemic issue with the underlying system architecture. Option A. Implement a series of quick fixes and workarounds on individual transaction types to bring their processing times back within the current acceptable tolerances. Option B. Immediately report the pattern to the highest level of management, requesting an urgent system-wide overhaul based on the observed deviations. Option C. Classify the deviations as minor operational noise and instruct the processing team to monitor them without further investigation. Option D. Initiate a formal risk reassessment process to investigate the root cause of the deviations and their cumulative impact, documenting all findings and proposed mitigation strategies. The correct answer is D. Initiate a formal risk reassessment process to investigate the root cause of the deviations and their cumulative impact, documenting all findings and proposed mitigation strategies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an immediate and informed response to a potential breach of risk management protocols. The core difficulty lies in accurately assessing the severity of the identified issue and determining the appropriate course of action without overreacting or underestimating the risk. The pressure to act quickly, coupled with the need for thoroughness, demands a structured and principle-based decision-making process. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of risk reassessment. This aligns with best professional practice as mandated by regulatory frameworks that emphasize a proactive and continuous approach to risk management. Specifically, it reflects the principles of identifying, assessing, and mitigating risks. By initiating a formal review, the professional ensures that the identified issue is thoroughly investigated, its potential impact is quantified, and appropriate controls are implemented or enhanced. This methodical approach provides a clear audit trail, demonstrating due diligence and adherence to regulatory expectations for robust risk governance. It prioritizes understanding the root cause and the potential consequences before making decisions, thereby preventing hasty or ineffective interventions. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately escalating the issue to senior management without any preliminary assessment. This fails to demonstrate professional judgment and can lead to unnecessary alarm and resource misallocation. Regulatory frameworks expect professionals to exercise a degree of autonomy in initial risk assessment and to only escalate when a clear and significant risk is identified and cannot be managed at the current level. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the finding as a minor anomaly without further investigation. This is a direct contravention of risk management principles and regulatory requirements for thoroughness. It risks overlooking a nascent but potentially serious issue, leading to significant future losses or compliance failures. Such inaction demonstrates a lack of professional diligence and a disregard for the organization's risk appetite. A third incorrect approach is to implement a superficial or ad hoc solution without understanding the underlying cause. This is ineffective risk management and can create a false sense of security while the actual risk persists or even escalates. It fails to address the root cause and is unlikely to satisfy regulatory scrutiny, which demands evidence of effective control measures. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. First, they must clearly define the identified issue and its immediate context. Second, they should gather relevant information to understand the nature and potential impact of the issue. Third, they must assess the risk associated with the issue, considering both likelihood and impact, against the organization's established risk appetite. Fourth, based on this assessment, they should determine the most appropriate response, which may involve further investigation, immediate mitigation, escalation, or documentation. Throughout this process, maintaining clear documentation and adhering to established internal policies and external regulatory guidelines are paramount. Question 8. Benchmark analysis indicates that a client who has previously expressed a strong aversion to market volatility is now requesting to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, sector-specific exchange-traded fund ETF that has experienced rapid growth, but also exhibits extreme price fluctuations. The advisor believes this investment is unsuitable given the client's stated risk profile and long-term financial goals. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Recommend a different, highly diversified, low-risk bond fund as a replacement for the client's current portfolio, without directly addressing the client's specific request for the ETF. Option B. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client, clearly outlining the specific risks associated with the requested ETF, including its volatility, potential for significant losses, and how it conflicts with their previously stated risk aversion and long-term objectives. Document this discussion thoroughly and allow the client to make an informed decision, while also providing alternative, more suitable investment options. Option C. Politely decline the client's request to invest in the ETF, citing general concerns about market risk, and suggest a more conservative, diversified fund without further explanation or alternative proposals. Option D. Immediately proceed with the client's requested investment in the speculative ETF, as the client's instructions must be followed to maintain client satisfaction and avoid potential complaints. Correct answer is B. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client, clearly outlining the specific risks associated with the requested ETF, including its volatility, potential for significant losses, and how it conflicts with their previously stated risk aversion and long-term objectives. Document this discussion thoroughly and allow the client to make an informed decision, while also providing alternative, more suitable investment options. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when the client's preference may lead to suboptimal outcomes or increased risk. The advisor must navigate this delicate balance, ensuring compliance with regulatory obligations while maintaining client trust and providing sound financial advice. The pressure to satisfy a client's immediate request, even if ill-advised, can be significant, requiring a robust understanding of regulatory boundaries and ethical responsibilities. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough and documented discussion with the client, clearly outlining the risks and potential downsides of their preferred investment strategy. This approach upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty by prioritizing the client's long-term financial well-being over a potentially detrimental short-term preference. It demonstrates best professional practice by ensuring the client is fully informed and capable of making an educated decision, even if that decision deviates from the advisor's recommendation. This aligns with regulatory requirements that mandate suitability and a client's understanding of investment risks. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with the client's preferred investment without a detailed discussion and documentation of the risks is a failure to meet the fiduciary standard. It prioritizes client satisfaction over client welfare, potentially exposing the client to undue risk and violating regulations that require suitability assessments and clear communication of investment characteristics. Simply refusing the client's request without providing an alternative or explaining the rationale behind the refusal is also professionally unacceptable. This approach can damage the client relationship and may not fully satisfy the regulatory obligation to provide advice that is in the client's best interest. It lacks the educational component necessary for informed client decision-making. Recommending a different, more conservative investment without fully understanding the client's underlying goals or risk tolerance, even if it seems safer, can also be problematic. This bypasses the client's stated preference and may not align with their actual financial objectives, potentially leading to dissatisfaction and a breach of trust. It fails to engage with the client's initial request constructively. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a framework that begins with understanding the client's stated objective and underlying motivations. This is followed by an assessment of the client's risk tolerance, financial situation, and investment knowledge. The advisor then proposes suitable strategies, clearly explaining the benefits, risks, and costs of each. If a client's preference deviates from the recommended strategy, the advisor must engage in a transparent dialogue, documenting the discussion, the risks highlighted, and the client's informed decision. This process ensures both regulatory compliance and ethical client service. Question 9. Risk assessment procedures indicate a potential for data privacy breaches during the candidate onboarding process for the RTX hiring assessment test. Which of the following actions best aligns with the regulatory framework and internal guidelines for managing such risks? Option A. Delegate the task of identifying and implementing a solution to a newly hired intern with minimal oversight, trusting their general understanding of data security. Option B. Adopt a widely used data security solution from another industry, assuming its effectiveness without specific validation against RTX's regulatory obligations. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the RTX hiring assessment, test specific data privacy policies, and relevant regulatory requirements to identify compliant and effective mitigation strategies. Option D. Immediately implement a new encryption protocol for all candidate data, bypassing internal review processes to expedite security enhancement. Correct answer is D. Immediately implement a new encryption protocol for all candidate data, bypassing internal review processes to expedite security enhancement. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the need for efficient risk mitigation with the imperative to adhere strictly to established regulatory frameworks. The pressure to quickly implement a solution, especially in a dynamic environment, can lead to shortcuts that bypass crucial compliance steps. The professional must exercise sound judgment to ensure that any proposed action is not only effective, but also fully compliant with the RTX hiring assessment test's specific regulatory guidelines, which are paramount in this context. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the RTX hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework and internal guidelines pertaining to risk assessment and mitigation. This ensures that any proposed action is not only effective in addressing the identified risk, but also fully compliant with all applicable rules and procedures. Adhering to the established framework demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing regulatory integrity and minimizing the potential for compliance breaches. This systematic approach ensures that risk mitigation strategies are robust, defensible, and aligned with the organization's risk appetite and legal obligations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately implementing a new, untested risk mitigation strategy without consulting the RTX hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. This fails to ensure compliance, potentially introducing new risks or violating existing regulations. It represents a failure to follow established procedures and a disregard for the regulatory environment. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on anecdotal evidence or industry best practices from other contexts, without verifying their applicability and compliance within the RTX hiring assessment test's specific jurisdiction. This can lead to the adoption of strategies that are not legally permissible or ethically sound within the defined regulatory boundaries. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to respect the unique requirements of the RTX hiring assessment test. A third incorrect approach is to delegate the entire risk assessment and mitigation process to a junior team member without adequate oversight or clear guidance on the specific regulatory requirements. This abdicates responsibility and increases the likelihood of errors or noncompliance due to a lack of experience or understanding of the stringent regulatory landscape. It is a failure of leadership and oversight. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should adopt a structured decision-making process. First, they must clearly identify the specific risk and its potential impact. Second, they must consult and thoroughly understand the relevant regulatory framework and internal policies of the RTX hiring assessment test. Third, they should brainstorm potential mitigation strategies, evaluating each against the regulatory requirements and internal guidelines. Fourth, they must select the most appropriate strategy that effectively mitigates the risk while ensuring full compliance. Finally, they should document the entire process, including the rationale for their chosen approach, to ensure accountability and provide a clear audit trail. Question 10. The efficiency study reveals a significant increase in processing times for a critical financial product, leading to potential client dissatisfaction and regulatory scrutiny. Which of the following actions best represents a professional and compliant response to this situation? Option A. Delay reporting the issue to senior management and relevant compliance officers until a definitive solution is identified and implemented. Option B. Initiate an immediate broad-based system rollback to a previous stable version without fully diagnosing the specific cause of the delay. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment, analyzing the effects on clients, market integrity, and regulatory obligations before proposing targeted remedial actions. Option D. Focus solely on optimizing internal system performance metrics, assuming client and regulatory concerns will resolve once processing speeds improve internally. The correct answer is B. Initiate an immediate broad-based system rollback to a previous stable version without fully diagnosing the specific cause of the delay. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a significant increase in processing times for a critical financial product. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a rapid and accurate assessment of the root cause without disrupting ongoing operations or compromising regulatory compliance. Pressure to identify and rectify the issue quickly can lead to hasty decisions that overlook crucial details or regulatory obligations. The correct approach involves a systematic impact assessment that prioritizes understanding the scope and severity of the issue before proposing solutions. This means meticulously evaluating how the increased processing times affect clients, market integrity, and the firm's ability to meet regulatory deadlines. It necessitates consulting relevant internal policies, regulatory guidance, and potentially seeking expert advice to ensure all potential ramifications are considered. This approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of due diligence and responsible conduct expected of financial professionals. It ensures that any remedial actions are well-informed, proportionate, and do not inadvertently create new risks or violate regulatory requirements, such as those pertaining to timely client communication or accurate reporting. An incorrect approach would be to immediately implement a broad, untested fix based on initial assumptions. This could lead to unintended consequences, such as further operational disruptions or the introduction of new errors, potentially violating regulations that mandate operational resilience and risk management. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the internal technical aspects of the processing delay without considering the external client impact or regulatory implications. This failure to consider the broader ecosystem of the financial service could lead to breaches of client service level agreements or regulatory obligations related to customer protection and fair treatment. A third incorrect approach would be to delay reporting the issue internally or to relevant stakeholders, hoping it resolves itself. This constitutes a failure in transparency and timely risk escalation, which is a direct contravention of many regulatory frameworks that require prompt notification of significant operational failures or potential client harm. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a structured problem-solving framework. First, clearly define the observed problem and its immediate symptoms. Second, gather all relevant data and information, including operational metrics, client feedback, and internal system logs. Third, conduct a thorough impact assessment, considering all affected parties and potential regulatory touchpoints. Fourth, identify potential root causes and evaluate their likelihood and impact. Fifth, develop and evaluate potential solutions, prioritizing those that are least disruptive and most compliant. Finally, implement the chosen solution, monitor its effectiveness, and communicate progress to relevant stakeholders. Question 11. Governance review demonstrates that while there is a strong drive within RTX to enhance operational efficiency through process optimization, there is a tendency to prioritize speed of implementation over thorough risk assessment and validation of proposed changes. This has led to concerns about potential unintended consequences impacting regulatory compliance. Considering RTX's commitment to both innovation and adherence to all applicable laws and industry standards, what is the most appropriate approach to process optimization in this context? Option A. Implement significant process changes based on anecdotal evidence of potential efficiency gains without formal validation or impact assessment. Option B. Focus solely on cost reduction as the primary driver for process optimization, assuming that efficiency gains will inherently lead to compliance. Option C. Implement process changes in a phased manner, with each phase undergoing rigorous risk assessment, impact analysis on compliance controls, and pilot testing before full rollout. Option D. Expedite the implementation of process improvements by bypassing formal change control procedures to achieve efficiency gains more rapidly. The correct answer is C. Implement process changes in a phased manner, with each phase undergoing rigorous risk assessment, impact analysis on compliance controls, and pilot testing before full rollout. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge stemming from the inherent tension between achieving efficiency gains through process optimization and maintaining compliance with established regulatory frameworks. The pressure to demonstrate tangible improvements can sometimes lead to overlooking critical control points or the potential for unintended consequences that could violate RTX's internal policies or external regulatory obligations. Careful judgment is required to balance the pursuit of optimization with the imperative of adherence to established standards. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and phased implementation of process changes, prioritizing thorough risk assessment and validation at each stage. This aligns with best professional practice by ensuring that any optimization efforts are not only effective in achieving their intended goals, but also do not introduce new vulnerabilities or contravene existing regulations. Specifically, this approach would involve detailed documentation of proposed changes, impact assessments on compliance controls, and pilot testing to identify and rectify any issues before full rollout. This methodical process minimizes the risk of regulatory breaches and upholds the principle of responsible innovation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to implement significant process changes based solely on anecdotal evidence of potential efficiency gains without a formal validation or impact assessment. This fails to adhere to RTX's internal governance policies that mandate a structured approach to change management and risk mitigation. It also creates a significant regulatory risk, as undocumented or unassessed changes could inadvertently lead to non-compliance with industry-specific regulations or data privacy laws, resulting in potential fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to bypass established change control procedures in an effort to expedite the optimization process. This directly violates RTX's internal control framework and demonstrates a disregard for the established governance structures designed to ensure operational integrity and regulatory adherence. Such a shortcut significantly increases the likelihood of errors, security vulnerabilities, or compliance failures, as the necessary checks and balances have been circumvented. A third incorrect approach would be to focus exclusively on cost reduction as the sole metric for process optimization, without considering the impact on service quality, data integrity, or regulatory reporting accuracy. This narrow focus can lead to the implementation of changes that, while reducing costs, compromise essential operational functions or create new compliance risks. For instance, automating a customer service process without adequate human oversight could lead to incorrect information being provided, potentially violating consumer protection regulations. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such scenarios should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a holistic view of process optimization. This framework should include 1. Understanding the regulatory landscape relevant to RTX's operations. 2. Clearly defining the objectives of the optimization, including both efficiency and compliance. 3. Conducting a comprehensive risk assessment for any proposed changes, identifying potential impacts on regulatory adherence and operational integrity. 4. Developing a phased implementation plan with clear milestones for validation and review. 5. Engaging relevant stakeholders, including compliance and legal departments, throughout the process. 6. Establishing robust monitoring mechanisms to track performance and compliance post-implementation. This structured approach ensures that optimization efforts are both beneficial and sustainable, upholding professional integrity and regulatory compliance. Question 12. Assessment of a professional's ethical obligations when a client reveals information suggesting they intend to cause serious harm to another individual, considering the paramount importance of client confidentiality. Option A. Immediately report the client's statements to the authorities and any potential victim without further investigation or consideration of professional guidelines. Option B. Maintain absolute silence and take no action, as client confidentiality must never be breached under any circumstances. Option C. Discuss the client's statements with other professionals not involved in the case to seek their opinions on the matter. Option D. Carefully assess the credibility and imminence of the threat. Consult relevant professional codes of conduct and legal advice if necessary, and document all steps taken before considering any disclosure. The correct answer is D. Carefully assess the credibility and imminence of the threat. Consult relevant professional codes of conduct and legal advice if necessary, and document all steps taken before considering any disclosure. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing client confidentiality with the potential need to disclose information that could prevent harm. The professional must navigate the ethical duty to protect client privacy against broader societal obligations or regulatory requirements that might mandate disclosure in specific circumstances. The difficulty lies in interpreting the scope of serious harm and determining when the threshold for disclosure is met, especially when the information is obtained through privileged communication. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a careful, documented assessment of the information received, considering the specific nature of the threat, its imminence, and the likelihood of it occurring. It requires consulting relevant professional codes of conduct, and if necessary, seeking legal or supervisory guidance. This approach upholds professional integrity by prioritizing ethical duties, while also acknowledging the potential for overriding obligations. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible decision-making, ensuring that any disclosure is proportionate and legally/ethically justified, thereby minimizing potential harm to the client and others. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately disclose the information without further assessment. This violates the fundamental duty of client confidentiality, which is a cornerstone of many professional relationships. Unless there is a clear and immediate threat of serious harm that legally or ethically mandates disclosure, such a breach can lead to disciplinary action, loss of professional license, and damage to the reputation of the profession. Another incorrect approach is to do nothing, assuming that the client's statements are not serious or that the professional has no obligation to act. This can be ethically negligent if the information clearly indicates a substantial risk of serious harm to the client or others. Professionals have a responsibility to act reasonably when faced with such information, and inaction can have severe consequences, potentially leading to legal liability and professional censure for failing to take appropriate steps. A third incorrect approach is to discuss the client's situation with colleagues who are not involved in the case and have no professional need to know. This constitutes a breach of confidentiality and can undermine client trust. While seeking advice is sometimes necessary, it must be done in a way that protects the client's identity and the sensitive nature of the information, typically through anonymized case discussions or consultation with supervisors or legal counsel. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Identifying the ethical and legal obligations at play, e.g., confidentiality duty to warn. 2. Gathering all relevant facts and assessing the credibility and imminence of any potential harm. 3. Consulting professional codes of conduct, ethical guidelines, and relevant legislation. 4. Seeking advice from supervisors, mentors, or legal counsel when uncertainty exists. 5. Documenting the assessment, the decision-making process, and the rationale for the chosen course of action. 6. Acting in a manner that is both ethically sound and legally compliant, prioritizing the minimization of harm while respecting professional duties. Question 13. Comparative studies suggest that while clients often seek to minimize their tax liabilities, financial advisory firms must balance client objectives with stringent regulatory compliance. Considering the UK's tax legislation and the Financial Conduct Authority's (FCA) principles for businesses, which of the following represents the most prudent and compliant approach when a client proposes a complex tax planning strategy that appears aggressive and potentially skirts the edges of acceptable practice? Option A. Immediately implement the client's proposed strategy as requested, assuming the client has sought legal counsel and is aware of the risks, to maintain a strong client relationship and avoid appearing uncooperative. Option B. Proceed with the client's aggressive strategy, focusing solely on the technical legality of each individual step without considering the overall economic substance or potential for anti-avoidance legislation to apply. Option C. Advise the client on the potential risks and legal implications of their proposed strategy, clearly outlining the boundaries of acceptable tax planning under current UK law and FCA principles, and offer to explore alternative compliance strategies if the proposed one is deemed too high risk or potentially non-compliant. Option D. Decline to offer any tax planning advice whatsoever, citing the complexity and potential for regulatory issues, and suggest the client seek advice from a specialist tax barrister. The correct answer is C. Advise the client on the potential risks and legal implications of their proposed strategy, clearly outlining the boundaries of acceptable tax planning under current UK law and FCA principles, and offer to explore alternative compliance strategies if the proposed one is deemed too high risk or potentially non-compliant. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for aggressive tax avoidance and the firm's obligation to adhere to regulatory frameworks designed to prevent tax evasion and promote transparency. The firm must navigate the fine line between legitimate tax planning and arrangements that could be construed as abusive or non-compliant. The professional challenge lies in interpreting complex tax legislation, understanding the intent behind it, and advising the client within those boundaries, while also safeguarding the firm's reputation and avoiding regulatory scrutiny. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the spirit and letter of the law, as well as the firm's internal ethical guidelines and professional body standards. This involves conducting thorough due diligence, seeking clarification from tax authorities when necessary, and clearly documenting the rationale behind any advice provided. It demonstrates a commitment to integrity and responsible professional conduct, ensuring that the firm acts as a trusted advisor rather than an enabler of potentially illicit activities. This aligns with the core principles of regulatory compliance, which aim to maintain the integrity of the financial system and public trust. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the client's aggressive strategy without sufficient scrutiny or independent verification would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to penalties for the client and the firm, reputational damage, and potential disciplinary action from regulatory bodies. It would demonstrate a disregard for the principles of due diligence and a failure to uphold professional standards. Another incorrect approach, such as outright refusing to engage with the client on any tax planning matters without understanding the specifics, might be overly cautious and could damage client relationships unnecessarily. But it would not inherently be a regulatory or ethical failure in the same way as facilitating noncompliance. However, it fails to provide the necessary professional service within ethical boundaries. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment. First, understand the client's objectives and the proposed strategy. Second, thoroughly research the relevant tax laws and guidance, considering both the literal interpretation and the underlying intent. Third, assess the potential risks of noncompliance, including penalties, reputational damage, and legal consequences. Fourth, consult with senior colleagues or specialists if the matter is complex or uncertain. Fifth, clearly communicate the risks and limitations of any proposed strategy to the client, ensuring they understand the potential outcomes. Finally, document all advice and decisions meticulously. Question 14. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of potential project risks. Imagine you are leading a bid for a significant new contract. During your due diligence, you uncover a substantial technical challenge that, if not addressed, could significantly delay project completion and increase costs. This challenge is not immediately obvious and would require specialized expertise to fully diagnose and mitigate. You are aware that disclosing this risk upfront might cause the client to reconsider awarding the contract to your company, potentially impacting your team's performance metrics for the quarter. How should you proceed with the bid? Option A. Fully disclose the identified technical challenge and its potential implications to the client, outlining possible mitigation strategies and associated costs, even if it risks losing the contract. Option B. Proceed with the bid, omitting details about the technical challenge, and plan to address it once the contract is secured. Option C. Propose a superficial workaround for the technical challenge that appears to resolve the issue for the bid, with the intention of addressing the underlying problem later if the contract is won. Option D. Briefly mention a potential area for further investigation, without detailing the severity or specific nature of the technical challenge, hoping it will be overlooked. The correct answer is A. Fully disclose the identified technical challenge and its potential implications to the client, outlining possible mitigation strategies and associated costs, even if it risks losing the contract. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a conflict between a company's desire to secure a significant contract and the ethical obligation to disclose potential risks that could impact the project's feasibility and the client's investment. The challenge lies in balancing commercial interests with transparency and fiduciary duty. The pressure to win the contract might tempt individuals to downplay or omit critical information, creating a significant ethical and professional dilemma. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing pressures and uphold professional integrity. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves transparently communicating all known risks and uncertainties to the potential client, even if it jeopardizes the immediate contract. This aligns with the principles of professional conduct and regulatory frameworks that emphasize honesty, integrity, and acting in the best interest of clients. RTX hiring assessment test, like many professional assessments, would expect adherence to ethical guidelines that prioritize disclosure over potential short-term gains. This approach builds long-term trust and reputation, which are invaluable assets. It also mitigates future liability and ensures the client can make an informed decision. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the bid without disclosing the identified technical challenges. This constitutes a failure of professional integrity and potentially violates regulatory requirements related to disclosure and fair dealing. It misleads the client into believing the project is more straightforward than it is, leading to potential financial losses and reputational damage for both parties. Another incorrect approach is to disclose the risks only after the contract is secured. This is deceptive and undermines the principle of informed consent. The client would have entered into the agreement under false pretenses, creating grounds for contract disputes and regulatory scrutiny. It demonstrates a lack of commitment to ethical business practices. A third incorrect approach is to suggest a superficial workaround that does not address the root cause of the technical challenges, while still highlighting it as a solution. This is disingenuous and fails to provide the client with a realistic assessment of the project's viability. It prioritizes winning the contract through misrepresentation rather than through honest assessment and problem solving. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a structured decision-making process. First, identify the ethical and professional obligations involved. Second, gather all relevant facts, including potential risks and their impact. Third, consider the potential consequences of each course of action for all stakeholders. Fourth, consult relevant codes of conduct, company policies, and regulatory guidelines. Finally, choose the option that upholds the highest ethical standards and professional integrity, even if it is not the most commercially advantageous in the short term. Open and honest communication is paramount. Question 15. To address the challenge of a client expressing a desire for aggressive growth investments, but later exhibiting significant anxiety and indecision when presented with moderately volatile options, what is the most appropriate professional course of action for a financial advisor? Option A. Initiate a detailed discussion to explore the client's underlying concerns regarding risk, reevaluate their risk tolerance profile, and propose investment strategies that more closely align with their demonstrated comfort level, even if it means adjusting the initial growth objective. Option B. Advise the client that their indecision indicates they are not suited for aggressive growth investments and suggest they seek advice elsewhere without further discussion. Option C. Proceed with the aggressive growth investment strategy as initially stated, assuming the client's anxiety is temporary and will subside once they see potential returns. Option D. Reassure the client that the proposed investments are standard for aggressive growth and encourage them to proceed, emphasizing the potential for higher returns. The correct answer is A. Initiate a detailed discussion to explore the client's underlying concerns regarding risk, reevaluate their risk tolerance profile, and propose investment strategies that more closely align with their demonstrated comfort level, even if it means adjusting the initial growth objective. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated investment objective and their actual risk tolerance, as revealed through subsequent interactions. A financial advisor must navigate this discrepancy to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and uphold ethical obligations to the client. The challenge lies in identifying and addressing the misalignment without alienating the client or compromising the integrity of the advisory relationship. Careful judgment is required to balance the client's immediate desires with their long-term financial well-being and regulatory mandates. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a proactive and thorough review of the client's financial situation and investment objectives, specifically looking for any divergence between the initial assessment and current understanding. This aligns with the principles of Know Your Customer (KIC) and suitability requirements mandated by financial regulators. By initiating a conversation to clarify the discrepancy and reevaluate the client's risk profile, the advisor demonstrates a commitment to acting in the client's best interest, a cornerstone of fiduciary duty. This process ensures that investment recommendations remain appropriate and compliant, mitigating potential regulatory breaches and client harm. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the investment strategy based solely on the initial stated objective, ignoring the emerging concerns about risk tolerance. This failure constitutes a breach of suitability obligations, as it neglects to ensure that the investment is appropriate for the client's circumstances and risk appetite. It could lead to significant client losses and regulatory sanctions for failing to conduct adequate due diligence and ongoing monitoring. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's expressed concerns about risk as mere apprehension, without further investigation. This demonstrates a lack of professional diligence and an unwillingness to adapt advice to the client's evolving understanding and comfort level. Ethically, it prioritizes the advisor's convenience over the client's well-being and regulatory compliance, potentially exposing the client to undue risk. A third incorrect approach is to immediately terminate the relationship without attempting to understand or address the client's concerns. While a difficult client relationship can sometimes necessitate such action, doing so without a genuine effort to reconcile the discrepancy or explore alternative solutions can be seen as unprofessional and potentially a failure to meet ongoing advisory responsibilities, depending on the specific regulatory framework's requirements for client termination. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to client management. This involves initial robust fact-finding, ongoing monitoring of client circumstances and attitudes, and open communication. When discrepancies arise, the professional reasoning process should prioritize understanding the root cause, assessing the implications for suitability and compliance, and engaging the client in a collaborative discussion to find a mutually agreeable and compliant path forward. This iterative process ensures that advice remains current, appropriate, and ethically sound. Question 16. Compliance review shows that a recently implemented process optimization initiative within RTX's hiring assessment division has significantly reduced the time taken to onboard new candidates. However, concerns have been raised regarding whether this accelerated process fully adheres to all stipulated RTX hiring assessment test guidelines concerning data privacy and candidate notification timelines. Option A. Assume that the optimized process, by its nature of being an improvement, automatically meets all RTX hiring assessment test regulatory requirements without further verification. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the optimized onboarding process against all RTX hiring assessment test regulations and guidelines, specifically focusing on data privacy protocols and candidate notification timelines, and implement any necessary adjustments to ensure full compliance. Option C. Rely on the team that developed the optimized process to self-certify its compliance with RTX hiring assessment test guidelines, given their intimate knowledge of the changes. Option D. Proceed with the optimized process as it has demonstrated clear efficiency gains, assuming that any minor deviations from guidelines are acceptable given the overall improvement in speed. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of the optimized onboarding process against all RTX hiring assessment test regulations and guidelines, specifically focusing on data privacy protocols and candidate notification timelines, and implement any necessary adjustments to ensure full compliance. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in process optimization where efficiency gains might inadvertently introduce new compliance risks. The professional challenge lies in balancing the drive for improved operational performance with the non-negotiable requirement to adhere to regulatory standards. A hasty implementation of an optimized process without thorough risk assessment can lead to significant legal and reputational damage. The correct approach, which involves a comprehensive review of the optimized process against all relevant RTX hiring assessment test regulations and guidelines, represents best professional practice because it proactively identifies and mitigates potential compliance gaps before they manifest as violations. This aligns with the ethical duty of care and the regulatory imperative to maintain a compliant operational framework. It demonstrates a commitment to both efficiency and integrity, ensuring that process improvements do not come at the expense of legal or ethical standards. An incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of implementation over a thorough compliance check fails to uphold the professional responsibility to ensure adherence to the RTX hiring assessment test framework. This could lead to regulatory penalties, fines, and damage to RTX's reputation. Another incorrect approach, which assumes that a process optimization inherently implies compliance, is a dangerous assumption that overlooks the nuances of regulatory requirements and the potential for unintended consequences. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the specific mandates of the RTX hiring assessment test. A third incorrect approach, which delegates the compliance review solely to the team that developed the optimized process, creates a conflict of interest and lacks the independent oversight necessary for robust compliance assurance. This undermines the integrity of the review process and increases the likelihood of overlooking critical issues. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This includes identifying all applicable regulations, mapping the optimized process against these regulations, conducting a gap analysis, developing and implementing mitigation strategies for identified gaps, and establishing ongoing monitoring and review mechanisms. This systematic approach ensures that process optimization efforts are both effective and compliant. Question 17. The evaluation methodology shows a candidate being assessed for a critical role within RTX. The assessor recognizes the candidate as a former colleague with whom they have a positive working relationship. The assessor is confident in the candidate's abilities, but is aware of the potential for unconscious bias. Which of the following actions best upholds the integrity of the RTX hiring assessment test process? Option A. The assessor immediately recommends the candidate for the role based on their prior positive working relationship and perceives strong qualifications, bypassing some of the standard evaluation steps. Option B. The assessor subtly adjusts the evaluation criteria to better align with the candidate's known strengths, ensuring a favorable outcome. Option C. The assessor proceeds with the evaluation, focusing solely on the candidate's objective qualifications and performance metrics as outlined in the assessment criteria, while maintaining a conscious effort to mitigate any personal bias. Option D. The assessor informs their supervisor of the personal connection and requests to be recused from evaluating this specific candidate, ensuring an impartial assessment by another qualified individual. The correct answer is C. The assessor proceeds with the evaluation, focusing solely on the candidate's objective qualifications and performance metrics as outlined in the assessment criteria, while maintaining a conscious effort to mitigate any personal bias. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure compliance with the RTX hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, which emphasizes fairness and transparency in candidate evaluation. The core of the challenge lies in maintaining objectivity when personal relationships might influence professional judgment. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the established RTX hiring assessment test guideline for candidate evaluation. This involves a systematic and unbiased assessment of all candidates based on predefined criteria, ensuring that personal connections do not compromise the integrity of the hiring process. This aligns with ethical principles of fairness and equal opportunity, and implicitly with any regulatory requirements that mandate non-discriminatory hiring practices. An incorrect approach that involves giving preferential treatment to a known candidate, even if they are qualified, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This violates the principle of meritocracy and can lead to accusations of bias or favoritism, undermining the credibility of the hiring process and potentially leading to legal challenges if discriminatory practices are alleged. Another incorrect approach, such as overlooking minor qualifications of a known candidate to expedite their process, also fails to uphold the rigorous standards expected in a professional assessment. This can result in hiring less suitable candidates and can be seen as a breach of duty to select the most qualified individual for the role, potentially contravening internal RTX policies or external regulations concerning due diligence in hiring. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the RTX hiring assessment test's evaluation criteria and a commitment to applying them consistently to all candidates. When a potential conflict of interest arises, such as knowing a candidate personally, the professional should proactively disclose this to their supervisor or the relevant HR department, and recuse themselves from any part of the evaluation process involving that candidate. This ensures transparency and allows for an objective assessment by an impartial party. The focus should always be on the candidate's qualifications and suitability for the role, as defined by the assessment's objectives, rather than personal familiarity. Question 18. The efficiency study reveals a significant variance between the projected and actual resource expenditure for the initial phase of a new technology integration project. The project team has presented preliminary data suggesting that certain software licensing costs were underestimated, while hardware procurement costs were overestimated. Which of the following represents the most appropriate next step in addressing this discrepancy, considering the principles of impact assessment and responsible resource management? Option A. Immediately reallocate funds from the overestimated hardware budget to cover the underestimated software licensing costs, assuming the overall project budget remains within acceptable limits. Option B. Advise senior management that the variance is within acceptable tolerance levels for a project of this complexity, and recommend proceeding with the original resource allocation plan. Option C. Conduct a detailed root cause analysis of the variance, specifically examining the assumptions and data used in the original impact assessment for both software licensing and hardware procurement, and consult with subject matter experts to validate revised estimates before proposing any adjustments. Option D. Issue a formal reprimand to the procurement team for the inaccurate hardware cost projections, and instruct the software licensing team to find cost savings elsewhere to absorb the overrun. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed root cause analysis of the variance, specifically examining the assumptions and data used in the original impact assessment for both software licensing and hardware procurement, and consult with subject matter experts to validate revised estimates before proposing any adjustments. Explanation: the efficiency study reveals a significant discrepancy in the projected versus actual resource allocation for a new product launch. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of impact assessment methodologies, balancing the need for immediate corrective action with the potential for overreaction or misinterpretation of data. The pressure to demonstrate swift problem-solving can lead to hasty decisions that might not address the root cause or could have unintended negative consequences. The correct approach involves a thorough reevaluation of the initial impact assessment, focusing on identifying specific drivers of the discrepancy. This means revisiting the assumptions made during the initial assessment, examining the data collection methods for accuracy and completeness, and considering external factors that may have influenced actual resource needs. This approach represents best professional practice because it adheres to the principles of robust impact assessment, which emphasizes data-driven analysis, transparency, and a systematic review process. It ensures that any subsequent adjustments to resource allocation are based on a clear understanding of what went wrong, rather than speculation. This aligns with regulatory expectations for responsible project management and financial stewardship, requiring demonstrable due diligence in resource management. An incorrect approach would be to immediately implement drastic, across-the-board budget cuts without a detailed analysis of where the overruns occurred. This fails to acknowledge that not all resource allocations are equally prone to error or external influence. It also risks starving critical components of the launch that may have been accurately resourced, thereby jeopardizing the entire project's success. This approach exhibits a failure to apply a systematic impact assessment review, potentially violating ethical obligations to stakeholders to manage projects competently and responsibly. Another incorrect approach would be to solely blame the project team responsible for resource management, without investigating the underlying assumptions or external variables that may have contributed to the discrepancy. This creates a punitive environment and ignores the possibility that the initial impact assessment framework itself was flawed. Ethically, this demonstrates a lack of fairness and due process, and regulatorily, it suggests a failure to implement effective internal controls and a culture of accountability that includes systemic review, not just individual blame. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the efficiency study's findings as mere statistical noise or minor deviations, opting to proceed with the original plan. This demonstrates a disregard for critical performance data and a failure to engage in proactive risk management. It ignores the potential for significant financial or operational repercussions and represents a dereliction of professional duty to monitor and adapt project execution based on performance indicators. This can lead to regulatory scrutiny for failing to maintain adequate oversight and control over project expenditures. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Acknowledging the discrepancy and its potential implications. 2. Initiating a structured review of the impact assessment process, focusing on data integrity, assumption validity, and methodology. 3. Engaging relevant stakeholders to gather insights and perspectives. 4. Developing targeted corrective actions based on the findings of the review, rather than broad-stroke interventions. 5. Documenting the entire process, including the rationale for decisions, to ensure transparency and accountability. Question 19. Consider a scenario where a senior RTX employee is responsible for negotiating a significant contract with a new supplier. During the negotiation process, it becomes apparent that the primary contact at the supplier company is a close personal friend of the employee from their university days. While there is no explicit evidence of impropriety, the employee recognizes that this personal relationship could create a perception of bias and potentially influence the negotiation outcome, even if unintentionally. The employee is under pressure to finalize the contract quickly to meet quarterly targets. Option A. Discreetly inform the supplier contact that while they are friends, business must be conducted professionally, and then continue negotiations without further disclosure to RTX. Option B. Proceed with the negotiation, assuming the personal relationship will not impact professional judgment and that the contract terms will be solely based on merit. Option C. Attempt to resolve the perceived conflict of interest by subtly negotiating more aggressively with the supplier to demonstrate impartiality, without informing RTX management or compliance. Option D. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to RTX's compliance department and seek guidance on how to proceed, potentially recusing themselves from further direct negotiation if advised. The correct answer is D. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to RTX's compliance department and seek guidance on how to proceed, potentially recusing themselves from further direct negotiation if advised. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a desire to secure a valuable contract and the obligation to maintain ethical standards and regulatory compliance. The pressure to meet aggressive targets can tempt individuals to overlook or downplay potential ethical breaches. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation, ensuring that short-term gains do not compromise long-term integrity and legal standing. The correct approach prioritizes transparency and adherence to RTX's internal policies and relevant regulations. By immediately escalating the concern to the compliance department, the professional demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence. This action ensures that any potential issues are investigated thoroughly and addressed appropriately, safeguarding RTX from future repercussions. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and the duty of care expected of employees. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the contract without disclosing the potential conflict of interest is a direct violation of ethical principles and likely regulatory requirements concerning disclosure and conflicts of interest. This could lead to accusations of dishonesty, a breach of fiduciary duty, and potential legal penalties for RTX. Another incorrect approach, attempting to resolve the issue independently without involving the compliance department, risks misinterpreting regulations or failing to implement adequate safeguards, thereby exposing RTX to significant risk. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the importance of specialized expertise in compliance matters. A third incorrect approach, downplaying the significance of the relationship to avoid scrutiny, is a form of deception and undermines the integrity of the contracting process. It fails to acknowledge the potential for undue influence or preferential treatment, which are key concerns in ethical business dealings. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential ethical conflicts and regulatory implications. This involves understanding RTX's code of conduct and relevant laws. When a potential issue arises, the next step is to seek guidance from the appropriate internal departments, such as compliance or legal. Documenting all communications and decisions is crucial. If unsure, err on the side of caution and escalate the matter. This proactive and transparent approach ensures that decisions are made with full awareness of ethical and regulatory obligations, fostering a culture of integrity. Question 20. The investigation demonstrates that a significant investor in a new venture is pressuring the firm to expedite the approval of a substantial investment, citing immediate profit realization as the primary objective. However, preliminary internal reviews suggest potential ambiguities regarding the venture's adherence to specific disclosure requirements mandated by the RTX hiring assessment tests regulatory framework. The firm's compliance department has flagged these ambiguities, recommending further due diligence before final approval. Which of the following approaches best navigates this situation, balancing stakeholder demands with regulatory and ethical responsibilities? Option A. Proceed with the investment approval immediately to satisfy the investor's demands, while assuring them that any minor compliance issues will be addressed retrospectively. Option B. Expedite the approval process by focusing only on the aspects of the venture that clearly meet regulatory standards, deferring the review of potentially problematic disclosure areas to a later date. Option C. Inform the investor that their profit realization timeline cannot be met due to regulatory hurdles, and suggest they divest their interest if immediate returns are their sole priority. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the venture's compliance with all RTX hiring assessment test regulations and internal policies, seeking clarification on any ambiguities, and only proceed with approval once regulatory adherence is confirmed. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the investment approval immediately to satisfy the investor's demands, while assuring them that any minor compliance issues will be addressed retrospectively. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the immediate financial interests of a key stakeholder and the long-term regulatory compliance and ethical obligations of the firm. The pressure to satisfy a significant investor's demand for rapid profit realization, even at the expense of thorough due diligence, requires careful judgment to balance stakeholder expectations with fiduciary duties and regulatory adherence. The correct approach, which prioritizes a comprehensive review of the investment's compliance with all relevant RTX hiring assessment test regulations and internal policies before approving the transaction, represents best professional practice. This aligns with the core principles of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct expected of financial professionals. It ensures that all potential risks, including those related to market integrity, investor protection, and the firm's reputation, are adequately assessed and mitigated. Adhering to the established regulatory framework of the RTX hiring assessment test is paramount, as it dictates the standards for responsible investment and disclosure. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the stakeholder's desired timeline, without adequate regulatory scrutiny, would fail to uphold the firm's duty of care and could lead to significant regulatory breaches. This could involve violations of rules pertaining to due diligence, risk management, or even market manipulation, if the investment is structured to artificially inflate short-term gains. Another incorrect approach, which might involve selectively presenting information to the stakeholder to justify the desired outcome, constitutes a breach of transparency and honesty, fundamental ethical principles. This misrepresentation can mislead the stakeholder and expose the firm to severe reputational damage and regulatory sanctions. A third incorrect approach, attempting to bypass established internal compliance procedures to expedite the process, directly contravenes the firm's governance framework and regulatory obligations, creating a high risk of non-compliance and potential misconduct. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant stakeholders and their interests. Subsequently, they must rigorously assess these interests against the firm's regulatory obligations and ethical commitments. When conflicts arise, the regulatory framework and ethical guidelines must take precedence. This involves seeking clarification from compliance departments, escalating concerns when necessary, and documenting all decisions and the rationale behind them. The ultimate goal is to act in a manner that is both legally compliant and ethically sound, safeguarding the interests of all parties, including the firm and its clients, over the long term.